Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Paul, and today we're going to have a virtual tour through the suburb of Hampstead up in North London, round about 4 miles away from central London. I often like to think to myself that Hampstead itself is one of the kind of like crown jewels in London's proverbial crown. And although I think the presence of the city itself can be seen along the high street, especially as soon as you slip into those little back streets, you can really discover the charm and the grace of this really quite ancient village, really dating back as far as 986, when it was gifted to the Benedictine monks at the Priory of Westminster, which is today where Westminster Abbey stands. Hampstead itself comes from the Anglo-Saxon words of ham and steed, which means, in modern English, essentially it means homestead. So up until about the 17th century or so, Hampstead itself was, largely speaking, just kind of like a sleepy little village, fairly far away, surrounded by woodlands. And it wasn't up until the 1600s, and the very late 1600s at that Hampstead became quite a fashionable place to go to. And that's mainly because chalybeate water springs were discovered all across the local area, and they became extremely fashionable, not only just here in London, but also just around the country itself. Chalybeate means essentially they're iron-rich water springs. So for those wealthy people who had quite a relatively rich diet, it really helps kind of cleanse their insides out. And it was seen as a very medicinal fact to do that. I won't go into more detail than that, but you get my point. You get the idea. Right up until 1860, when the railway appeared, from that point onwards, Hampstead's population dramatically increased, and up to about 100,000 people would come to Hampstead on the railways just for weekends and public holidays, for leisure and other kind of ways just to escape the pollution and the congestion of London. The Cockneys of East London came up with the fantastic little catchy rhyme called Appy Hampstead, and they used to sing it along, have wonderful tea parties and all sorts of things up in Hampstead Heath at a time when, if you can imagine it, just going to Hampstead was seen as basically a holiday. Maybe nowadays it seems a bit kind of a different, but you know, things were different back then. So, and that's really when the residential buildings in the area started to be formed. It's not really until the Underground arrived in 1907 that Hampstead itself expanded even further throughout the 20th century into what it is today, developed into. We're sort of going to start off our tour mainly on Hampstead High Street, just looking at Hampstead Underground Station. This underground station itself has got the fantastic significance of being the deepest underground station on the network itself at 58.5 meters, designed by Leslie Green, and which is quite characteristic of those kind of oxblood red tiles for many of his stations that he opened up. Originally, it was named Heath Street, and if, of course, you go down to the platform level, then you can see those original tiled signs of what it was originally named. Now, although the high street itself is quite a busy place, from the road itself leading up behind Hampstead Station, heading towards the top of the hill, you can of course find another underground station. Well, I say that, it's really a disused underground station in Hampstead itself, and that is Bull and Bush, or North End as it's more accurately called. North End itself never really opened as a proper underground station, and if you were to go to it, you would find that it has been fenced off, as today it is largely kind of just an access point for the underground network itself. In fact, if you were to go there on Hampstead Way, where it's located, you would find that it's quite a sleepy little location, and it's almost unusual, the idea that they would even have an underground station in these parts. The idea initially was that the Hampstead Heath extension was at the very end of the road, was due for complete renovation. They were going to extend the houses, build essentially council estates, as we might think of them today. And it was actually a woman by the name of Henrietta Barnett who petitioned to preserve the local area, which was farmland at that time, and saved it from development. And today we have ourselves Hampstead Garden suburb standing in the large area around it, primarily because of the works of her itself. But as you're sort of standing there at Hampstead, or sort of rather North End, you would actually locate one of the oldest buildings in Hampstead. Now, it's a little bit difficult to see, but across from North End Station, just above the bushes, there is this wonderful little tower, all in white wood, just sort of looming over the road almost. And this is part of Wilde's Farm. Now, the complex itself, which is relatively vast, dates to the 1600s, and it is one of the last farmhouses that still stands here in the local area. Originally, the land that Wilde's Farm stands on today dates back to 1259, when it was owned by Eton College, who owned it all the way up until 1907, when the Hampstead Garden Suburb Trust was established. Now, you can actually get a little bit closer to Wilde's Farm. If you go to the end of the roads, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a road called Wilde's Close. And if you sort of travel up it, then you will eventually end up at the sort of the front of this relatively modern looking style. But if you were to cut through Wildwood Road, which runs to the left of the entranceway to Wilde's Close, you'll see that there are entrances through the woodland, and if you follow the right one, then you'll end up at more of this property. So it's quite nice. I mean, it is quite an important location in terms of historical factoids, mainly because people such as Charles Dickens lodged within this location itself. In 1837, he actually moved here with his sister after his sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth, passed away. It's said that Dickens himself had a dream of Mary every night in his bedroom at Wilde's Farm out of grief. The area around Wilde's Farm is where Bill Sikes in Oliver Twist escapes to after fleeing from London itself. The old curiosity shop proprietor, Dick Swiveller, moves into a cottage in Hampstead, which some suggest is Wilde's Farm. So Wilde's Farm itself is definitely very important. And of course, probably one of the next most notable people is William Blake, who actually lived here along with his colleague, rented out between 1824 to 1828. He and John Linnell lived there, the painter. But if you do go through Wildwood Road to actually try to locate Wilde's Farm, which is always a nice treat, it's fantastic to go through these little woodland areas. These are the kind of woods that have been retained and preserved on purpose in this way. And I think it's easy to imagine how, when you think of the novels written by C.S. Lewis, like the Narnia series, with the abundance of lampposts all everywhere across Hampstead almost, especially in the Heath. It's easy to imagine how he came up with the idea of the lamppost in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So next time you end up going through Hampstead Heath itself and you see a lamppost surrounded by trees, maybe you might be inspired into a fantastic tale yourself. At the very opposite end of Wildwood Road, that's if you're going through the Hampstead Heath extension past Wilde's Farm, going north to almost to the very top of the hill itself, you end up on the Spaniards Road. And the Spaniards Road itself is really one of the exit or entry points into the district of Hampstead, at least historically speaking. You'll find on the left-hand side of the road, as you turn left, you'll see it there on the corner, the toll gate house, and that marks a spot where you would have been entering or exiting Hampstead. On the opposite side of it would have stood the Bishop of London's private hunting estate, entering into the lands of Finchley and beyond. Today, it is one of the divisions amongst the London boroughs and stands as the borough boundary between Camden and Barnet across the road. You'll see there's a black plaque which sort of tells you a little bit about the toll gate itself. And across from it, you'll see that there is the Spaniards Inn. Now, the Spaniards Inn is a Grade 2 listed structure dating back to the 1700s, so the 18th century. Now, it's said that the name itself comes from the Spanish ambassador, whereby two Spanish ambassadors used to stay here and they fell madly in love with one of the women who worked there. It's said that they actually had a duel over her in the grounds of the Spaniards Inn, and one of them was killed and buried near the inn itself. And it's said, allegedly, that he himself still haunts the pub himself today, still searching for his lost love. But it's not the only ghost that still haunts the place. It's said that the ghost of Dick Turpin, the notorious highwayman, he himself, in fact, haunts the location as well. It's noted in some historical records that Dick Turpin did indeed visit this location, but as a highwayman, he would have gone to a lot of different taverns all across him. But some people say that his father was, in fact, a landlord here, and that would have been in the very early 1700s. But it's debatable whether or not he really was. But the idea that he's probably frequented this, that's most likely the case. There are certainly many pubs in and across what would have been the outskirts of London at the time that Dick Turpin did appear. And it's said that he, of course, haunts this location even to this very day. Now, the pub itself is mentioned by Dickens himself again. You can't go through London for more than 5 minutes, I think, without meeting Charles Dickens again. So here we are once more. He mentions it within the Pickwick Papers, which are a fantastic example of what life was like in the countryside at the time, where these individuals from the Pickwick Club, they go out there and they go on their little adventures in and across the country. And so Charles Dickens writes about the adventures of these individuals. Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, used to write here, and allegedly this is the location where John Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale. At least that's according to what the pub says anyway. But we do know that other people, such as John Constable, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson, William Hogarth, Joshua Reynolds, George Byron, they all visited here. I mean, these are huge names in and across the 17 and the 1800s, novelists, poets, who really made a huge difference on English literature, and this pub has got references to all of them. So it's a fantastic place to go, and it's got a wonderfully large beer garden to visit as well, if you like an outdoor seating area. In the 1780s, rioters during what was called the Gordon riots, which kind of like anti-Catholic riots, marched upon Hampstead itself, intending on attacking Kenwood House. And it's actually the location here where it's said that the landlord stopped all the rioters, offered them free drinks until they had either passed out or were just so drunk anyway that they had hung out for a few hours. And during that time, he had called the local militia, and they all arrived, arrested them all. And we still have Kenwood House. That stands today, thankfully. It hasn't been destroyed. Kenwood House is just a little bit way up Spaniards Road, in the opposite direction to where we've come from Wildwoods Road. You have to keep on going around the corner and you end up at Kenwood House. You walk through the main entranceway and you'll be presented by this wonderful facade, the frontage of Kenwood House, which is extremely grand and a very beautiful kind of location. It dates to the 1700s, really. It was modified quite extensively, but the original building would have dated back to 1616, which was gifted to John Bill, who was one of the printers in King James's court, and he managed to build a relatively modest brick building here. The brick building itself, largely speaking, doesn't really exist, but it has been modified, so it's still technically, parts of it anyway, behind the facade that you see of Kenwood House. If you go around to the opposite side, so the south end of Kenwood House, you'll see that really it's been modified by William Murray in the 1740s to be incredibly ornate. It's got this wonderful kind of neoclassic stucco design to it upon its facade, which are essentially plasterworks which have been created to give just this more wealthy and ornate look to it. Most of these were added towards the 1760s by Robert Adam, the architect himself, and the building itself is well worth to go. Whether or not you go inside or just walk around the outside, it's extremely beautiful. Today, it was sold out in 1914 by the 6th Earl, Lord Mansfield. And he basically had a house sale for 4 days, sold everything within it. Most of this was purchased by an earl that I can't actually pronounce the name of, Iviga, I believe. He purchased the house itself and the surrounding acres around the area and established the Kenwood Preservation Council. And that was vested to the London County Council, where it was stipulated that it ought to remain free to the public as a fine example of the home of gentlemen of the 18th century. If you have a look, the views around Kenwood House are spectacular. One of the more fantastic places to see are, of course, the ponds. If you were to be standing in the gardens, you see that the ponds are just before you, and there is a wonderful little bridge which just stands there. This bridge itself is unfortunately not a real bridge. It's really just a fake. And if you have a look around the back, it gives you this example of, oh, actually, it's a bit disappointing, really, isn't it? You know, you go around the back and it's a little bit disappointing, but it gives you this idea that actually it's a lot grander and a lot more fancier than it really is. But nonetheless, this would have been a wonderful place to stroll around. And as you have a look around the gardens of Kenwood House, you really do get that idea. And this would have been designed for those wealthy individuals who had come here from wherever they might be originating from and be able to stroll around the gardens. It certainly wouldn't have been intended to walk to the other side of the bridge, just simply to give you the idea that the Lord Mansfield had one. Of course, the most famous view in Hampstead is that of Parliament Hill. You can leave the estate of Kenwood and you can find yourselves views of Parliament Hill all across the overall estate. Here you get pretty amazing views of the local surrounding area. Looking down towards London itself, you can see the City of London, Canary Wharf, and all other local landmarks. One of the prime locations you can see is St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a requirement by law to be able to see St. Paul's at certain vantage points all across certain parts of London. One of the things you can see if you're on a clear day is the Crystal Palace Transmitter Tower, which is over 10 miles away. And that does mean that if you stand at Crystal Palace, if it's a good day, you may well see the one in North London, which is at Alexandra Palace. Now, in terms of the name Parliament Hill, it's debatable as to where exactly it originates from. It's not truly known. A lot of people suggest it dates to the English Civil War, when the site was occupied by troops loyal to the English Parliament. It's said that Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby, who were the people who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament on the 5th of November, they themselves, in fact, camped out here on that very night and supposedly were intending on watching the explosion. But of course, that didn't happen as it was planned. They did not succeed on that one, of course. So, traveling through Hampstead Heath itself, you will eventually locate a wonderful little signpost. It directs you in lots of different locations as to where you might want to go. And one of the locations is, of course, Keats House. This is located on Keats Grove, and it's named after one of the most famous residents of the location. John Keats himself was a famous poet whose works include Ode to a Nightingale or On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Now, it's a Grade 1 listed structure, and this is where he lived from 1818 to 1820 with his friend Charles Brown. It's said here that he composed 5 of his odes, along with some of his most famous ones that I've mentioned, that are regarded by many as some of the best in English literature. Now, the house is normally charged, but you can actually go into the gardens for free. And it's said that if you go into the gardens and you find the plum trees, that is the specific location that Ode to a Nightingale was composed. This is also the house that John Keats fell in love with Fanny Brawne, who lived in the adjacent house. Today, they've been modified, so it's just one single house. But when Keats lived here, this was a series of houses, and this is where they became engaged. Unfortunately, Keats himself suffered quite terribly from tuberculosis and passed away in the following year, in 1821, having moved to Rome shortly before in hope of alleviating that disease through warmer climates. But unfortunately, passed away just at the young age of only 25 years old. It's well worth visiting, I think to myself, and it has recently been restored in 2009. Now, if you retrace your steps back to Hampstead Heath a little bit and take the next street on the left from Keats Grove, you'll end up on Willow Road. And there at number 2 Willow Road, you will in fact find the house designed by Erno Goldfinger. Now, this was his home, built in 1939, and it's a fantastic example of the modernist style of the time. It's well worth to go inside of this location for an architectural tour. Guided tours tend to take place between 11 and 2, but if you don't want to go on a tour, you can actually enter the house from 3 p.m. On the charge, but you can sort of freely roam around. Now, one of the more famous stories connected to the location is that the next door neighbour didn't quite appreciate this building himself. He thought that it was ugly, horrible fact that he had demolished the beautiful little cottages that stood next door, and his name was Ian Fleming, probably the most famous for writing the James Bond novels. He himself, it's said, based the villain of Ulrich Goldfinger after Erno Goldfinger, who lived next door to him. Now, is that true or not? I mean, that's a fantastic story. It really is. Based on all the accounts from Fleming, he says that it has absolutely no connection whatsoever. But if you ever read a book or if you ever watch a film where it states the statement of all characters are fictional, that really originates from this point, because Goldfinger essentially took Fleming to trial for this one, and he stated that he would sue him for everything that he could have. Fleming said, well, how about if I just add the sentence, all characters are fictional in the book at the very beginning? Is that okay? And Goldfinger said, yeah, that's fine. That's perfect. I'm very happy with that. And it was fine. It was a little truce. So whether or not that's true, it's a fun story, but he's probably not. At the very top of the road, you'll end up at Burgh House. Burgh House itself is the home to the Museum of Hampstead itself. It's one of the oldest buildings in the area and dates to 1704, where it would have been established as a merchant's house, which would have been pretty commonplace back then. Merchants themselves living out in the countryside and then travelling in to London to do business. It's named after one of its residents who lived here from 1822 to 1856 by the name of Alliston Burgh, because Burgh himself, although a vicar of St. Lawrence Jewry in the city, was so hated by his parishioners for being such an abrasive man in the city that they actually petitioned the Queen herself to have him removed. He thought enough's enough. He moved up to Hampstead, and it was during that time that he lived here that actually Hampstead Heath was up for complete renovation, not just the heath that I mentioned earlier, but the whole thing. And he, being quite a stubborn and not that likable character based on people who met him, petitioned the local council to save Hampstead Heath. So sometimes you do need that kind of strong character to kind of rescue some things. Now, you will find black plaques and blue plaques all across the area. One opposite is to Marie Stopes, who is the reformer and pioneer of the family planning movement. But if you head up to the very top of the road, you may well find, in fact, a little bit of a surprise. Just past the Well Tavern on Well Walk, named after all of these chalybeate spring wells that once would have drawn people here. Taverns like this really, give that example of people wanting to come here for their fantastic medicinal values. You'll find a plaque to John Constable. This is the third house that he lived in. This is the house that he passed away in. Just next door to it is actually the first house to John Keats. So he moved to the Keats house that we have today, but he actually moved 1 year earlier to this location here. There's no plaque or anything that would tell you that he actually was living here, but this is actually where he lived in 1817 with his brother, hoping that his brother would be able to recover from tuberculosis himself before the following year moving off to Keats Grove. And you will see there is a chalybeate spring well standing there just directly opposite. And that's where people would have been able to get their water and, feast upon the iron-rich springs and be able to cleanse themselves from whatever might be troubling them. Now, if you head up the road opposite the spring well, this kind of narrow pathway, you'll end up looking at the Parish lockup. Now, this here is an example of what would have existed before the police were established in 1829, a location that not only is a Grade 1 listed structure, but also means that for the people here who might have done something wrong, you'd have been locked up into this location and you would have been staying there for one night until you were able to be carted away into central London for like a judicial meeting. However, they did eventually have so many people that during the latter part of the 1700s, a local magistrates' court was established behind this structure within what used to be a large mansion called Cannon Hall. Cannon Hall itself has been divided up into multiple different establishments now. So today, the parish lockup is the private entrance into number 11, which makes up the grounds of what was once Cannon Hall. But if you go up to the very top of the road itself, you will see Cannon Hall there, denoted by the fact that it has huge cannons right outside of it. And cannons themselves, they're the precursor to modern day bollards that you will find on the street itself. All across London you will find bollards, but initially they would have used cannons, and these would have been recycled from various war galleons, wars in general, and used to line the pavements so that horses and carts wouldn't interfere with the pie heading on down them. Now, if we leave the parish lockup itself and head around past Cannon Hall, where it stands today with its cannons, and around the corner, you will end up on this beautiful little street, and you will locate the plaque to Sir Henry Cole. Henry Cole himself changed the way that we view Christmas in a large way. He's responsible for the commission of Christmas cards themselves. In 1843, he was commissioned by John Callcott Horsley to make an artwork for this idea of a Christmas card. Now, this is at the same time when, just not 3 years earlier, Rowland Hill had established the penny black and a reform to the postal service. Now, before this point, if you wanted to post things, you'd have had to have sent your thing, would have been free for you, but when it arrived, that person would have had to have paid for their postage. And that depends on all sorts of things. Travel by sea, by land. Was it delivered in the afternoon or in the morning? How big is it? How small is it? How many words it has? The postman could just make it up. Who cares? Whatever it was, the postman just had a little bit of a lottery. You really could make a little bit of money about that. But the worst thing is, of course, if you were, waiting to hear back from a loved one and you recognise their handwriting, then what might happen is you might receive the letter, see that it's addressed to you, and recognise that, oh, I guess my loved one is alive. Fantastic. I don't want the letter. I won't pay for it. Send it back. And then, of course, the postman is a bit screwed. But Rowland Hill reformed the postal service and thought a prepaid stamp for just 1 penny, paid by the actual sender, would be a great idea. And ultimately, Henry Cole had a fantastic idea of a card with a wonderful little image on the front. He thought at Christmas it would be the perfect time to communicate to loved ones all across the world, and it did amazingly well, fantastically well. So much so that today, of course, Christmas cards are sort of part and parcel of the overall era. Today, we often consider certain symbols of Christmas part and parcel of that as well. Things like red robins, things like snow. Now, we have snow in Christmas partly thanks to Charles Dickens. Dickens himself grew up during the early 19th century, and there was huge snowstorms back then as we were leaving one of the last remains of a ice age, it was known as. And so he experienced huge snowfalls, things like where the River Thames actually iced over. Now, what that meant was that when he wrote his books, like for example Christmas Carol, he wrote them with Christmas being a snowy idea. Now, postmen themselves, they would have bright red uniforms to distinguish themselves, and this eventually they became known as Robin Postmen, and eventually that morphed into the Robin Bird that we might today associate with Christmas. So we have ourselves these two gentlemen to kind of thank for it. The last one of these cards that was put on to auction back about 5 years ago or so, from 1843, went up for £22,500. So if you happen to find one of these wonderful little cards from 1843, you will be a rich person. And today, of course, postcards are £1 million industry all across the world. Now, if we cut out from this location, turn left at the top of the road, we'll cut through Hampstead High Street again, where Hampstead Underground Station is, and we'll end up on one of the best preserved streets in Hampstead, at least according to the architectural expert Pevsner. Now, the location itself is Church Row, and this is a fantastic example of late 1700s Dutch-style red-faced houses. Not much of the street has really changed, with the exception of the fact there are now cars here. If you weren't here, there are no cars. It's perfect. One of the modifications, however, though, is that these buildings have had their extensions modified. At the back of the building, women in the 1700s would have had a special room just to keep their wigs. It was a fashionable thing to do, and women would have had a lot of wigs. Of course, men would have had wigs as well, but women would have had a few more, as it was a bit more fashionable for them to change around. Today, we don't really have a use for wig rooms. I mean, maybe, but probably not. And so most of these buildings have had that refurbished and converted into an actual practical extension. That's the main modification that they've had. But along this road itself, you've had famous people living here, such as Peter Cook, who lived at number 17 with his widow Wendy. They rented out one of the coach houses, but this is the location where he and Dudley Moore would have written some of their satirical television shows. He entertained people like Keith Richards, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. Alfred Douglas, the lover of Oscar Wilde, lived at number 26. At the very end of the street and lived George Gilbert Scott, who raised his son Giles Gilbert Scott at this location. Giles Gilbert Scott, most famous for the K2 telephone box, and George Gilbert Scott, famous for the design of the Midland Hotel at St Pancras, to name just one thing that they're famous for. Another individual who lived here was H.G. Wells. There's no plaque to H.G. Wells outside of his house, but he lived at this location at number 17, which is the same place that Peter Cook lived. He himself only lived here for a year in 1909 with his wife Jane and his two sons. This is the location that he had one of his most infamous affairs, because H.G. Wells had affairs all the time. He was a notorious individual for these types of events. He had essentially an illegitimate child with a writer by the name of Amber Reeves. Now, by this point, Wells was 43 and she was just 22. It was quite a scandal of the time. Her family essentially rushed her into marriage very quickly to a family friend by the name of George Blanco White, just in order to win custody of the child so that Wells would have no part in that child's upbringing. Something that really affected Wells himself. He was quite devastated by this. But, I wouldn't feel too bad about it if it wasn't, about Wells. But he was a little bit self-centered. Example being, he would often have images of his mistresses by his bedside table, which his wife didn't really appreciate. And Wells himself was quoted to have said that he didn't quite understand why exactly his wife wanted those images removed every night they went to sleep. Very strange. It caused him distress that his wife wanted to do this. I don't even know what to say. At the very end of the actual street itself, you will find the parish church of St. John. Now, the parish church itself dates to 1312, but the actual building that we see, most of it dates to 1744, when it was completely refurbished. Parts of the building at the very, very base do date to the original one, but most of it is from 1744, mainly because of the growing population of Hampstead. Couldn't really accommodate that smaller church, but also ultimately the previous church was also falling down based on the fact that it had been standing here since approximately 986, when the area was given to the monks at Westminster. There are plaques within the churchyard donating all of the important people who have been buried here. You can see a list of them here within the churchyard of St. John's themselves. Now, you could really spend a long time walking around here and having a look at all of them. If you walk down the little path, rather idyllic sort of location, you'll eventually end up at the tomb to John Constable. Not only him, but also his family. This is where they're buried, at the very base of the path. This is the location that inspired Bram Stoker to write the novel Dracula even more. Hampstead itself features in a number of places. Within it itself, the troupe of vampire hunters led by Van Helsing. go out into the churchyard in the book, and they go to essentially drive a stake through Lucy Westeros, and it is this churchyard that he himself bases the actual church in. The tomb of Lucy Westeros is based on a different churchyard in Hendon, but the actual grounds of the church are based upon this location. So there are many famous people who are buried within the cemetery itself. Another famous person is John Harrison. Harrison himself is the individual who created the first marine chronometer, which enabled sailors to be able to calculate longitude and distance. That meant that really it solved a lot of the problems of navigation across the globe for the first time in the world. I think walking around Hampstead Cemetery, it's easy to sort of see exactly how you might well be inspired to create a spooky and maybe creepy kind of location, especially for Dracula novels. Across the road, there is an extension of the actual cemetery, and there's another plaque which tells you about who was buried within this location itself. At point number 5, you have the Llewellyn Davis family. They themselves are the inspiration for the Lost Boys in J.M. Barrie's book Peter Pan. They themselves are buried in this location, but next to their tomb, you will actually locate another famous group of individuals, and these are the Collins family. Possibly one of the most famous people is Jackie Collins, who is a famous writer who was born here in Hampstead in 1937, but you may also have heard of her potentially equally as famous, if not maybe more, sister Joan Collins, who was born in 1933, but not in Hampstead. She was born in Paddington and raised in Maida Vale. Heading up past this beautiful extension of their cemetery, you will find at the very, very top of the road on Hollyberry Lane a black plaque, which is to the Watch House. And that there is for in the 1830s, the newly formed Hampstead Police Force set out on its patrol and nightly watch. Now, of course, they were joined, in fact, by the people who lived in Hampstead. They didn't trust them. They thought the police were up to no good. And so every night when they would leave this location, they would be joined by a mob of angry, surly Hampsteadites watching their every move. It was one of the reasons why the Special Investigation Unit wasn't established for a further 10 years after the police force was founded, because they thought the idea that special investigation services might be seen as something that people might view as an invasion of privacy, especially based on the fact just in general they were seen as that. Just around the corner from this is a plaque to Robert Louis Stevenson. I always like this plaque. From the fact that it says 1850 to 1894, he lived here, suggests like he literally lived in this location for that period of time. But in reality, he didn't actually live here for that long. He stayed here for a couple of weeks, some summers, occasionally, as a place to just sort of go for where it was nice, open-aired, and then he'd end up going down into central London, where he would essentially go into the various kind of gambling dens and other kind of gentlemen's clubs that he might well disappear to. I do mean just gentlemen's clubs, where wealthy people might well disappear. And of course, he's partly famous, mostly famous, maybe for being the writer of Treasure Island or The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Just around the corner from this, we have ourselves this wonderful, beautiful building, which used to be one of the medical institutions here in Hampstead, but today is private residences. I always like to throw this out for people who might want a bit more of a contemporary connection out there, not just endless amounts of historical information. But across this residential block here, you will find that there is this wall, and upon it there are little graffitis, and they're always there. Sometimes they get washed off, but people always put them back on, and these are the Spice Girls, because Mel C used to live within it. So during the 1990s, that apartment block was filled with the rowdy girls having loads of parties and loads of fun. Not that people necessarily appreciated it, but if you are a Spice Girls fan, this is literally a pilgrimage site that people go to on a regular basis. So just around the corner, you'll find one of the oldest houses in Hampstead, dating to 1693. It is Fenton House. Today, it's a wonderful museum dedicated to the 1700s. And if you go up to the balcony itself, you'll actually find that they have fantastic views all looking southwards towards London. You can see St Paul's Cathedral, the city, much like upon Parliament Hill itself. It's well worth to go inside, and they got wonderful grounds around them. They got a beautiful apple orchard, beehives, and mainly during autumn they have like an autumn festival. Well, they'll have apple bobbing, apple picking, sell cider, all that kind of thing. If you were to go inside, and I always recommend it, it's always well worth it, you'll see really beautiful Georgian and Victorian decor all across it, as well as wonderful images of China, and they got a fantastic harpsichord collection across their entire gallery. Within it as well, you'll see lots of portraits. Some of the portraits are going to be to King William IV, King George IV, and also to Dorothea Jordan. Dorothea Jordan herself was somebody who is said to have lived within Fenton House itself, and she was the mistress of the Duke of Clarence, who eventually became King William IV. One of her descendants is not the previous Prime Minister, but the one before her, David Cameron. David Cameron is the ×4 grandson of Dorothea Jordan and King William IV. So if you ever wonder, David Cameron, what a wonderful man he is. Is he possibly related to royalty? You would be right. Yes, he absolutely is. Yes. Just around the corner, we have ourselves the Admiral's house. The Admiral's house dates to 1791 during the reign of King George III, and was modified by Captain Fountain North, who used the top to resemble a ship's quarter deck. Every royal birthday and naval victory, he would fire a cannon atop it in celebration. And P.J. Travers, person who wrote Mary Poppins, based the home of Admiral Boom from this fantastic story about Captain Fountain North. But it's called Admiral's house. He was not an admiral, of course, unfortunately, but indeed. And you will see a little plaque to George Gilbert Scott upon it as well, as he also lived here during his life, having previously lived on Church Row that we saw. In the next slide, you'll see there's a little black plaque just around the corner. It's just around the corner from Admiral's house. This is a black plaque to John Constable. This is the second house that he lived in before moving to the one that we saw earlier. The first house doesn't exist any longer, unfortunately. And at the very, very top of the road, you will end up upon Hampstead Heath again. This is looking towards Hendon and Harrow, and this is literally the point where John Constable actually would have painted those famous views of those locations at a time when not only could you see them, but also they weren't as nearly as built up as they are. This is the location which is called Judge's Walk. Said that during the Great Plague of London in 1665, this is where judges drew court to escape the plague. It's also a location of many other things as well, such as the Hampstead Observatory, Whitestone Pond, and Jack Straw's Castle. Things that I mention, but I'm not going to go into any more detail, because this has kind of been like a whirlwind walk through Hampstead itself, and ultimately I've only touched upon some of the things that have taken place here. There's lots more to see, and I hope that it has not only been entertaining and interesting, but also something that might well inspire you to head out into Hampstead yourself and have a good look later. All being well, maybe we'll be able to do a tour in the next year or two of Hampstead, and then we'll see these areas in much more detail, as well as many of the other parts that I did not include. But I'd like to thank you all for joining me, and thank you very much for listening to me during this time. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you, Paul. Great stuff. You've shown us some fascinating buildings and brought them all to life with stories about the people who lived there. We were probably expecting Charles Dickens. He seems to pop up in many of your walks, and maybe John Constable, but the Spice Girls, who would have thought it? Thank you for all the research that went into that talk, and for walking the walk with your camera. Doing it with video gave us the feeling that we were with you on the walk. Sadly, we just weren't getting the exercise, but hopefully one day soon we'll be able to join real walks with you again. Thank you to everyone for watching. If you're not a member of the Friends, then please consider joining us. The details are on the Friends website. Please also remember the museum's appeal to help fund its ongoing future. Sadly, as we record this in early November, the museum is temporarily closed again, but should reopen on Thursday, the 3rd of December. Our next presentation should be a talk by Andrew Braddock. Marking the 50th anniversary of London Country, Andrew will speak about his experiences working for that company in the early 1970s. Please join us then.